Okay, welcome to another session with the Cycling Physios. I'm Tim, Bianca's sitting in the background, and we are joined this evening by James Spragg, who is a fantastic combination of academic and practitioner, and has been very active talking about some of the research he's been doing on cadence and power and torque. So he's very kindly volunteered to talk to us this evening about some of the research and some of the case studies that he's been working with. So I'll stop talking. I'll hand the mic over to James and let you talk to us all about power and torque.
Perfect. Let me just pull this up. So just check, you can see that, Tim?
Yeah, you can see that, James. All good.
Okay, there we go. Yeah, so, well, I'll say thank you to Bianca for, I guess, inviting me, as in inverted commas, to present this evening. I very much got a topic and a date from her. But no, it's actually really good to be able to present to you, because I think this is an important topic within cycling, and it's something we don't look at the torque velocity relationship enough, and it kind of follows on from some of the talks that we've had previously, especially JP's from last week on performance modeling. So a quick introduction to myself. So my name is James Spragg. And I kind of split my time three ways, essentially. So I'm a PhD student at the University of Cape Town, and my supervisor there is Duran Swart, who's actually presented with Wendy Holiday on this channel before. I coach endurance athletes through my company Spragg Performance, and I also work as an applied sports scientist and performance consultant in a company that I have here in Austria with two colleagues, Dan Morang and Peter Leo. So that's kind of how I split my time, basically. So let's jump in. So what is torque? Okay. So torque is the force that we apply to the pedal. Okay. Now, all different power meters will measure torque in different ways, but essentially what we're measuring is the propulsive torque. Okay. So it's the force that we apply to the pedal that moves those pedals around. We might apply forces to the pedal in other directions, but they're not typically measured by our power meter. Okay. So torque is simply the force that we apply to the pedal, and it's measured in Newton meters, okay? Now, whenever we talk about torque, we should always consider the velocity at which it is being applied. Now, in cycling, typically when we talk about velocity, we talk about cadence, and we typically talk about RPM, okay? Now, actually, that's not quite the right unit, scientifically speaking. The right unit for that is radians per second, and all a radian is essentially a section of the circumference which has got the same length as the radius of that circle. Okay, so that's hence the name radians. So we always need to talk about torque and velocity together, and when we combine them, we get power. Okay, so we're very used to talking about power in cycling, and power values get thrown around and threshold values get thrown around. However, hopefully this evening I can convince you that we need to look a little bit past power and look at its component parts, so torque and velocity, to give us a little bit more insight into performance, okay? So let's have a look why we might want to do that. So here's some data from A.V. Hill all the way back in 1950, okay? And what this shows is for an individual muscle fiber, and let me put up my little laser pointer here, it shows that an individual muscle fiber can produce a lot of torque at very low velocities, or it can produce not much torque at very fast velocities, okay? So here, the thick black line is our torque cadence relationship, or our torque velocity relationship. And what we can see is this is the resultant power, okay? So you can see there's actually a sweet spot where the power is the highest with a certain torque and a certain shortening velocity, okay? Now, the way you need to kind of consider this graph is that all powers underneath this dotted line are possible. We can produce all those powers, okay? However, when we're looking at the very highest powers, they can only be produced at a certain shortening velocity, a certain range of shortening velocities, actually. And we can apply this to an individual muscle fiber, we can apply this to bundles of muscle fibers, and we can actually apply this to whole body exercise, okay? So if we want to produce those very highest powers, we can only produce them at a given velocity, if that makes sense, a given ranges of velocity. So let's move on. That's an individual muscle fiber. Let's look at kind of fast twitch, slow twitch fibers. Okay, so here we have some data from Gregor and colleagues back in 1979. And what they looked at is the force-velocity relationship and the resultant power in predominantly fast twitch and predominantly slow twitch athletes. Okay, so we can see that at all but the very slowest velocities, the fast twitch group were able to produce more force for any given velocity. Okay, and as a result, we saw a higher power output in the fast twitch group. Now, that's what we might expect. That fast, athletes with predominantly fast twitch fibers or more fast twitch fibers can produce higher, forces and resultant higher powers. Sustaining that might be a different matter, but at least for those peak values, they're going to be producing higher values. Okay, so this tells us something, but we shouldn't give up on our slow twitch athletes, and we also shouldn't try to improve the performance in our fast twitch athletes. Okay, so the force velocity relationship is also trainable. So McCartney and colleagues back in 1985 looked at an untrained group and a trained group, and then looked at differences in the force velocity relationship between those groups. So the lighter kind of dotted line is the untrained athletes, and obviously the darker line is the trained athletes. And you can see essentially what we've got here is an upward shift. Okay, so the trained athletes are producing essentially just more power at the same velocities. The peaks of these two curves, occur at the same sort of velocity, probably around 110, 120 RPM. But these athletes are essentially are stronger, so they can produce more force at the same velocity, and as a result, more power. And this kind of brings me to something that was kind of drilled into me during my masters when I was doing a little bit of strength and conditioning work or work in that area. If you're trying to make an athlete more powerful, the first thing you do is make them stronger. And we can see why that is from that graph. So, if someone can produce more power at the same velocity, obviously they're producing more, more force at the same velocity, obviously they're producing more power. And actually here, we saw, at kind of 160 RPM, we saw a 200 watt jump, okay? But that's not the only way we can shift this curve around, okay? So we can actually move this curve to the right, so the peak kind of, comes in at higher velocities, or actually we could even shift it to the left and have this peak come in at lower velocities. And we can actually shift it up and right, or up and left, or down. It can shift in all directions with training. And how we might want to change the force velocity relationship and the resultant power is something we'll look at in a little bit later in one of the case studies. Okay. So let's have a look. Kind of, we've spoken about sort of individual muscle fibers, bundles of muscle fibers, and now kind of whole body exercise. But let's apply that into cycling. So as we know, and as I've spoken about, power is torque times velocity. Okay. So let's look at one example. Here we have a rider producing 350 watts riding uphill, and they're producing it at 70 RPM. Okay. So the force they need to produce to reach that 350 watt target is 47.75 Newton meters. If you look at that same 350 watts in a completely different setting, so here we have individual pursuit, now the cadence is up at 110 RPM, and the power the force that's required is much lower. It's down at 30.38. Okay, so we actually see a 57% difference in the torque that these two athletes are having to produce, yet they're riding at exactly the same power. So when we're looking at the underlying determinants and the underlying physiology of these two kind of scenarios, obviously they're going to be very different. And we don't get that from the power number alone. And this is where I kind of talk about we need to, start as physiologists, as cycling coaches, whenever we're working with this data, to probably look a little bit further than just that power number and say, okay, how is that power number being created? So I'm going to highlight this point kind of in another way. So here is some data taken from the Road World Championships. And it was from a female athlete from Imola. And she actually finished in the top 15 the world champ, so world-class athlete here. And what I've done is I've taken the second-by-second power data that we get back from a power meter and kind of obviously recorded in our head units. And I've essentially broken each one of those power values down to its component values. So we've got a torque value and a cadence value for each kind of second-by-second power data. Now I'm going to add on top of that some other data. So here's data from the Track World Championships. So again, female athlete. This athlete was actually top 10 in the world. And this data is recorded in the Omnium event. So obviously a little bit difference in the event. So we've got one event that's 3.5 hours long in terms of Road Worlds, and we've got one that's 4 times, kind of 10 to 15, around 12 minutes, something like that. But we can see that, there's very different patterns in these relationships between these two events. To really highlight this, those 2 points represent exactly the same power output. So on the road, that 305 watts is being produced at, let's say 40, 45, 50 RPM, something like that, and almost 70 Newton meters. Whereas here on the track, this athlete is producing it with 130 RPM and maybe 20-ish Newton meters. Okay. And we can see, where most of the data falls is very different in those 2 scenarios. And that's something that we need to take into account when we're profiling athletes, when we're looking at the determinants of performance in a given event, and essentially when we're looking to improve performance in those events. So we're going to actually run with this data from the Track World Championships a little bit. So here's that same data again. And what I'm going to do here is highlight the peak power output, okay? So this is the peak power that this athlete recorded. It's a little over, I think it's about 980 watts, something like that. And we're going to look at where the cadence at which this peak power occurred, okay? So we can see it occurred at around 125 RPM, okay? So what we're actually looking at there is, to go back to one of our earlier screens, we're looking at the peak power value here. And we can see that the velocity that occurs at. So we know that peak power for this athlete occurs at 125 RPM. If we go higher than that, we start to come down this side of the curve and we start to lose power. If we go to shorter, if we go to slower cadences, we also start to lose power, okay? So this peak power value and this value of 125 RPM represents the peak of our curve. And we can actually use that information to enhance performance. That data was taken from the Omnium event, but actually this athlete was looking to target the Madison event. And you can see here a photo of your typical sort of Madison chaos, if you like. So for those that aren't 100% familiar with the Madison, essentially it's a race that's 120 laps, sprints every 10 laps, 5, 3, 2, and 1 points to the first 4 teams or people across the line, double points in the last sprint. You get 20 points for lap in the field, and the team at the end with the most points wins. Okay, so that's the simple bit of a Madison event. However, the complex bit comes in that it's running teams of 2. So you have a rider that's in the race and a rider that's out of the race at all times. The rider out of the race is resting and going a lot slower, and essentially they're getting lapped. When that rider that's in the race moving faster comes and catches them up from behind, the resting rider will drop down and they'll perform a handsling and swap positions. Now, because riders are only in the race for 50% of the time, it's a race that's pretty fast because the power that athletes can put out is much higher because they're only in the race for 50% of the time, which keeps the speed high. Okay, and that's going to be important in our next slide. So we actually did some performance analysis of the Madison event. Okay, and what we've got here is we've got data from World Cups, World Championships, and European Championships. Okay, and we've got the minimum, the maximum, and the average speed in a block of 10 laps. Okay, so the previous sprint would have been here at 0, and then our next sprint lap is here at lap 10, if that makes sense. So what we've got is, in the beginning, we've got some kind of residual speed left over from the previous sprint, and then we've got a period of kind of 5 laps here where actually everything's at a relatively, and it's relatively speaking, slow speed for the Madison at least. And we see maybe a few undulations where people have attacked and things like that. But this, sorry, I should just point out, this is bunch speed. Okay, so this doesn't take into any account any breakaways or something like that. This is the average speeds of the bunch. But what you can see is there's a real ramping up of speed into each sprint, okay? And the reason for that is that because the speeds are so high here, so kind of up to 61k an hour, it's very difficult on the track to go past people at that speed, because obviously you've got to kind of come out and go the long way around them in the banking. So not only have you got to go faster, you've got to go further. Now, there's never been an occasion where a team that was further back than 5th coming into, at the bell lap, so at 1 lap to go, so in this position here, has scored a point in the subsequent sprint. So if you're not in a good position here, if you're not in the top 5 teams here, then you're simply not scoring in that sprint, okay? So actually what we can see is at this point, between laps 7 and 8, there's a really big fight for position as teams try and position themselves in order to be in a good position with a lap to go to score in the subsequent sprint. Okay, so what we need to do is we need to optimize power production at this point of the race. And when we kind of drill that down, we know we've got speeds of 54 to 61 kilometers an hour, okay? And now because, on the track, people use fixed gears, and so there's a fixed relationship between the gear that you're using and the speed that you're traveling and the cadence that you have to pedal at, we can put all those pieces together. And what we do is we simply get a kind of performance problem. Okay, so we've got the kind of physiology. We know at which cadence this athlete produces their peak power outputs. We've got the performance analysis. We know the speeds at which this athlete needs to perform, needs to be able to make those big efforts to allow them to get into good positions, to set them up to score points. And all we have to do is then find a gear that allows them to do that. So essentially we need to find a gear that this athlete can ride at, let's say 125 plus or minus 5 RPM at those speeds that we kind of identified, okay? Now, because everyone loves an Excel sheet in sports science, I did one for this athlete. And essentially all they had to do is put in their max speed that they expected and the minimum speed they expected, and it kicked out, some recommendations of gears. And for this particular event, we got values between, we got gear ratios between 56 and 58 and 15 to 16, okay? And they worked pretty well. Now, it's always a little bit of a compromise because you have those, that quite a wide range of speed at which you want to optimize power production. But, we can actually then start to make some decisions. Is this athlete more interested in positioning themselves and putting themselves in a good position? In which case we might want to, look to optimize this 54K an hour, or are they actually looking to go around people in the sprint because they can already position themselves really well? And, we might be looking at kind of this optimizing more up towards the 61 sort of range. Now, what I will stress here, and this is something that JP touched on last week, is that obviously these kind of speeds are dependent on a number of factors. Okay, so actually dependent on the track, on the weather, the air pressure, the equipment, and also the altitude, and also the level of competition. Okay, so these things aren't fixed. This is why we kind of created a spreadsheet where you can actually alter these speeds. And what we would do in a competition setting is kind of have some markers throughout the competition about how fast, the scratch races run off, or how fast the individual pursuits run off, and we'd know if, conditions are fast or slow, and we'd adjust these speeds accordingly, and then that would adjust our kind of a gear recommendation. So we managed to optimize at 125 RPM, but actually we might want to do a bit more than that. So I spoke earlier about the ability to move the power, to make changes in the force velocity relationship and the resultant power. Okay, and actually we identified with this athlete that 125 RPM value was a little bit low, and actually what it meant is that they had to be on such a big gear to bring their cadence down to 125 for those very fast sprints that they felt a little bit over geared in the rest of the event. Okay, and they felt that the torque requirement and how hard they were having to push on the pedals to kind of meet accelerations was a little bit difficult to do in those middle laps, if you like, where they wanted to break away or follow attacks, etc. So actually, with this athlete, we did two things. So we did a lot of motor pacing, and actually, the motor pacing is one thing that we use to monitor changes in the force velocity relationship as well. And we did a lot of strength and conditioning. So we made this athlete stronger, but we also managed to make this athlete a bit faster as well. So we did some kind of assisted jumps, things like that. So working on strength to start with, and then moving into kind of a speed focus. And actually, we managed to create essentially a rightward and an upward shift in their force velocity relationship, which meant that their peak power actually occurred at around 130 RPM, and the force that they could produce went up to 80 Newton meters from 72, okay? And that actually gave us a 16% improvement in peak power. So rather than just looking at the power and trying to improve that, we managed to improve the gear that they were riding as well. So they managed to be on a little bit lighter gear, which improved performance in the other events. And we managed to, track changes in their force velocity profile that told us kind of which direction we were going, and rather than just looking at power numbers, which obviously improved as a result. So that's a kind of an example of how we can use force velocity profiling to improve performance. Now, I kind of want to take you a little bit outside of the world of cycling. to a sport that's not too far away to look at kind of some profiling. So I was very lucky to work with an athlete who was at the time the European 800 meter T33 record holder, essentially. So T33 is wheelchair racing, and this athlete had cerebral palsy, which obviously affects their motor control. Okay, now they wanted to move from the 800 into the 100 meter event. So they wanted to essentially go from an event which is 2 minutes in length to one that was about 17 seconds. And the reason for that was that there was no T33 800 meters at the Paralympics. So they wanted to, move into a higher prestige event. So we were interested about if they were able to meet the speed requirements in the 100 meter event. And how we managed to test that was we actually used something called a dynamometer. So a CSMI Cybex is what they typically refer to, dynamometer. And we managed to get it in a way that it essentially replicated how the athlete hits this push ring. So the way these athletes kind of propel themselves is there's obviously a 700cc wheel, same as you'd have on a road bike, and then there's a push ring kind of attached to that. And actually, what they do is they kind of punch that push ring with essentially rubberized, vulcanized gloves, and that powers them forward. So what they have to be able to do is push that push ring faster than it's currently going to be able to accelerate their chair. Okay, if they're not pushing it at least the rate that push ring's going round at, they're going to be slowing the chair. The analogy is, imagine if you've got a shopping trolley full of shopping and you're trying to accelerate it as it runs away from you down a hill. You've got to kind of be going faster than that shopping trolley to apply any force to it. So what we did with the dynamometer is we managed to take some measurements of their chair and some measurements of their position, some measurements of their push ring size. And we managed to rig up a situation whereby they felt, okay, that feels like when I'm pushing my push ring in a race. And once we had this kind of set up, if you like, then we could go and do some kind of testing with this athlete. So we looked at a number of things, but the first thing we looked at is the torque that this athlete could produce at different points within the race. So at different points within the race, they're going to be going at different speeds, which means their push ring is going to be going at different speeds, and they're having to apply a force to that push ring at different rates. Now the speeds that we used in degrees per second, and they're down here on the x-axis, and these represented kind of phases within the race. So obviously the 0 is that initial push when the wheelchair is static, and then the first 7 pushes took us up to about 60 degrees per second. The next, kind of 8 to 15 took us up to 120, and then from kind of 16 onwards, we were up around, sort of 120 to above 180, possibly up to 240 degrees per second. Okay, and we actually saw some interesting things. So with the right arm, we saw a relatively flat profile. Okay, but with the left arm, we saw a real difference in the amount of force that they could apply at those speeds. As the wheelchair sped up, or as we at least replicated that. And we can see that in some of the graphs here. So what we did is we got them to push on this dynamometer that kind of replicated their push ring, and we got them to do that 3 times to get kind of 3 measures. And we can see at 60 degrees per second, the force profiles look relatively similar. So along the x-axis here, we have the angle, so that's where they're applying the force within that pushing motion, and we have the amount of force created on the y-axis here. So obviously a little bit of a difference, but relatively similar here. When we look at 180 degrees, we can see that they're really struggling with their left arm to produce kind of any force, and actually weren't even kind of reaching 30 Newton meters. Whereas with the right arm, they're actually producing over 100 Newton meters still at that speed. And that was going to have some implications for actually steering in the event. So obviously 100 meters, they've got to stay within their line, and the wheels aren't fixed by an axle so that they can spin independently. So actually, there was a lot more force being applied to one wheel than there was the other wheel, and that had some implications about how they kind of steered their chair. The next thing we looked at was if they were even able to push their ring fast enough that they didn't slow it down. So you imagine if they can't at least match the speed at which their ring is currently rotating, that push ring is rotating, if they touch the ring at that point, it will actually slow the chair rather than accelerating it or keeping that same speed. So we got them to kind of push at a relatively low force at 60, 120, 180, and 240 degrees per second, okay? Now, obviously at 60, we were all fine. Both arms, they could reach that target. 120, same again. 180, they were starting to struggle a little bit, but it wasn't too bad. But at 240 degrees per second, they were really struggling. So they were a long way short of being able to push that push ring fast enough. And actually, luckily for them, peak speed happens somewhere in between those two things. Okay, and it certainly isn't as high as 240 degrees per second, but it's probably a little bit higher than 180 degrees per second. Okay, so we kind of went one step further in order to be able to test that. So we were quite happy that we could say to this athlete, given the speeds that you are going to be traveling in a 100-meter event, yes, you can just about meet the kind of the velocity requirement in terms of the push speed. However, what we need to do is make you stronger in order to make you more powerful, so that you can produce more force at the same velocity and essentially produce more power, which is going to make you go a little bit faster, especially in the kind of the latter stages of this race. So a little bit of a roundup. So torque production is velocity specific. Power is torque times velocity, cadence in cycling, but the highest powers are only available at certain velocities. We can train the torque velocity relationship, so we can train athletes to produce more torque at the same velocity, so an upward shift. We can also train athletes to produce the same torque, but at higher velocities, again, increasing in power, but that's a little bit harder to do. We should always consider torque and velocity when looking at power data, because it gives us a little bit more insight into what's going on. And the torque velocity relationship can be used to both maximize performance and profile athletes for given events. And there we go. I'm happy to take any questions. Let me just end this show. Can't hear you, Tim.
It's the classic 2020, 2021, isn't it? You're on mute. Sorry about that. Bianca's still sitting in the background there, but I've got the questions coming in. So, here we go. She's popping them up on the screen there. So, yeah, first one came through from Robert right at the very beginning. Looking at, have you looked at power expansion paths? This is the path in the force velocity plane that describes how one increases from, say, 300 to 350 watts.
No, is the answer to that. No, it's not something we've looked at. I think how athletes accelerate or how they produce more power and how that comes in, if that makes sense, is something that we could probably look at in the future. To be honest, it's we just haven't gone that far with it. Essentially, people are already kind of a little bit fixated on power, so we're trying to move that to looking at power velocity relationships. And I know Robert's actually done a lot of kind of work in this area, so he's probably actually a little bit more advanced than how we're bringing these concepts across to athletes at the moment and trying to get buy-in from those athletes and taking that kind of going baby steps, if that makes sense. So Robert's probably a few steps ahead of where we are currently at in terms of applying force velocity relationships to improve performance and to profile athletes.
Okay, fair news. We might have to get Robert to come and have a chat to us at some stage then. We'll check on next. So next one coming up from Malte. Is there a correlation between max strength torque and the ability to sustain sub-max torque? For example, sort of best 20 to 30 torque, and would heavy gym work increase both or only maximal?
Yeah, okay. So it's a really good question. So critical torque gets thrown around a little bit, and it's something that I think there's a little bit of misconceptions about. So typically when we measure critical torque, we do it in an isometric contraction. So for example, in rock climbers, we're interested in how hard they can, crimp on small edges. So there's no movement in the fingers. And at that point, we can measure their critical force. And we can do that in a number of ways. So we can do that in, kind of get them to pull really hard, easy, pull really hard, easy. And we see that kind of, hyperbolic relationship that we see with power. When we're talking about, the maximum torque that can be that can be held for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, there's a big interplay with the cadence and also the power that's produced at. So yes, if you, let's take, for example, a cyclocross rider. That's a really nice example. So a cyclocross rider needs to produce power in a number of different ways. So from, very fast kind of courses where you're riding on tarmac all the way through to, very deep mud or very deep sand. Okay. So if they're not strong enough, when the resistance is really high, when they're going through that deep sand or that deep mud, they simply don't have the torque available to produce the power. So in that case, things like heavy gym work would be really beneficial for that athlete because they improve the amount of torque that athlete can produce at those low cadences. Okay, so yes, heavy gym work is really good if you've got an athlete that has to produce high, or you want them to produce as much power as possible at low cadences essentially. But it's also a really nice step into, like I said, getting that athlete stronger to get them more powerful. And then you can kind of work on the speed afterwards. So in the example I gave with the track rider there, the speed work probably only came in the last 6 weeks before their sort of target event. So once we dropped kind of the loads in the heavy gym work that they were doing previously, that's when we kind of saw that increase and that rightward shift in the torque velocity relationship. So yeah, it's certainly heavy gym work is certainly something we can use as a tool to improve power production.
So again, it's the athlete-specific nature of it, really, though, isn't it? So yeah, next question coming in here. So sort of talk on its implications for injury. So maybe kind of anterior knee pain if we're putting our physio hats on.
Yeah, probably a little bit out of my area of expertise, to be perfectly honest. Yes, there's certainly, if you're introducing any new stimulus, you need to be a little bit careful with it. So if we're going back to that heavy kind of gym, heavy load resistance work, then obviously, that has implications for can they do it correctly in terms of and safely in terms of technique and that sort of stuff. And to be honest, that's where me as a physiologist would actually be led a little bit more by physios, medical team, strength and conditioning coaches. And that's where this kind of, all comes together, if that makes sense. So I probably not myself qualified to answer that question in terms of injury potential.
I think if I put the physio hat on here, it's our classic example would be spring knee in cyclists where, suddenly ramp up the mileage and also get out in the hills and maybe starting to do some low cadence grinds up the hills. And it's about that tissue adaptation, isn't it? So if anybody's going to start playing around with their cadences, whether it's going for low cadence or spinning super high, but I think particularly if we're going low cadence, we've got to build into it gradually in the same way that we would build into that gym program gradually. Because those forces, if we think about our sort of free body diagram of the knee joint and the compressive forces at the patellofemoral joint, well, as the torque goes up, then those compressive forces will correspondingly go up. So I think, it's certainly an implication there that, it might be that if we have got somebody with anterior knee pain, so patellofemoral pain, that we look at producing that power with higher cadences to maybe look at then reducing those compressive forces. Does that sort of fit in with your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think also if you break down those, so people are used to riding to very specific power values, but they obviously change when you change the cadence that someone's trying to produce. What you can do for a certain period of time is going to change when you change the cadence that you're doing it at. So actually breaking that, power apart and looking at the torque that you're producing and the cadence you're doing it at can actually guide that process a little bit. So, let's say that you're riding at, you're riding particularly when you do like threshold intervals, let's say at 40 Newton meters. Do you know what I mean? We don't want to get you to go to 80 Newton meters in your low strength work straight away. Do you know what I mean? So by breaking that apart, you've maybe got a benchmark straight away that you can say, okay, well, let's try 45. Do you know what I mean? Let's kind of just incrementally increase those rather than going like, boom, okay, let's try and ride at threshold at 30 RPM,
Yeah. That maybe sort of feeds into this question here about what's the sort of force velocity relationships and maybe hill climbing and other sort of optimal relationships there that people can train for.
Yeah, so I mean, typically, cyclists, as they want to produce higher powers, will shift towards higher cadences. And so when we talk about maximal sprinting, that's going to be up at 120, 130. When we're looking at maybe 3-5 minute powers, something like that, it's probably going to be 110 RPM, maybe something like that. However, obviously, when you've got a hill climb, you've got a higher resistance against you. So the resistance, your force you've got to create to get over that, gravity essentially pulling you and your bike backwards is higher. So I think hill climbs are something where you could definitely use torque velocity profiling to optimize your performance, and you can use it around your gears as well. So we often see riders. I watched the Koppenberg cross this weekend, and I saw some riders going up the Koppenberg, and I know there's kind of implications for getting grip and stuff like that, but they were way outside of their optimal sort of range. They were down at 30 RPM. No one's producing their peak powers at kind of 30 RPM. So actually, when we're looking at these events, we can actually look at gearing, look at training for it, look at training for those kind of for the determinants of that event essentially, and breaking those power values down into their component parts allows you to kind of just see a bit more of the picture.
I think, like you're saying about the determinants of the event, because also the duration of the event that they're training for. My world being long distance triathlon, we're talking about 4.5, 5 hours, 6 hours on the bike, and it's that neurological fatigue as well, and that needs to be taken into account. Maybe come back to that one in a minute. So this question coming in from Jack about how might crank length impact torque?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean,
we have talked about crank length on some of the other podcasts.
Okay.
What's your take?
Pretty much crank length doesn't influence how much power you can put out. That it comes down to that, and you want to produce power. Do you know what I mean? At the end of the day, we want to produce power, so it pretty much doesn't influence that. So, it can influence aerodynamics, for example, so it can keep you a bit more compact, and you might want to explore that as an option. But yeah, basically, maybe it would if we went ridiculous. Do you know what I mean? But we're not kind of doing that, so I'm not. I don't think it has a big influence, especially on power production.
No, it's about that mechanical efficiency, which is where the crank length comes in. So, Peter, what do you think about the reliability and validity of torque values produced by mobile power meters?
Honestly, pretty terrible. So, the way that torque is measured is probably different from power meter to power meter, but we don't kind of get access to those algorithms. So, for a SRM, I believe it's something like from 30 to 150 degrees that torque is measured. Okay, and then it doesn't measure, when the pedal's coming back up. But what you also have to consider is you always have to consider the torque and velocity. So how is the velocity being measured, and how often is that being measured? So actually, when we get these second by second, data points, if that makes sense, in terms of power, there's a lot of averaging that's gone on before that hits your head unit and before that hits your kind of training peaks account. It doesn't necessarily mean we have to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater and say that's completely rubbish data, if that makes sense. But we do have to be, a little bit cautious when we're kind of, looking at this data. It's power data, anything coming from a mobile power meter is not great, to be honest, even the power values. And one thing that people forget is power meters are designed to be good to themselves. So they're designed to be good to themselves day after day after day. They're not designed to be good to each other. And so you kind of have to, be careful about, you don't want to make too many comparisons between athletes or between, or for the same athlete using different power meters. So the data I presented there for the track rider came exclusively from their professional SRM on their track bike. We wouldn't actually compare that to the data on their road bike.
That's it. It's that sort of reliability within that particular athlete, and we kind of don't necessarily pay attention to what the number is. It's just whether that number's going up or down, trending over time. If anybody wants to learn more about power meters, then Rory did a really good presentation for us. So look back on our channel there for Rory's talk. Question here from Stefan. What are your physiological considerations for classic submaximal high torque, low cadence intervals? So some are arguing that it should help achieve a shift towards type 1 by fatiguing our type 2 muscle fibers. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. So there is honestly if you look at the scientific literature, there's almost no evidence in favor of doing the classic high torque, low cadence intervals in athletes. I do them with my athletes.
And I do them as well, yes.
It's not an area that's that well explored, but I certainly do it with my athletes. It can certainly help, to replicate some scenarios, if that makes sense, within racing, which is always kind of, we can always use that as a tool as coaches, if that makes sense. Kind of, a replication is the first thing we do. In a way, it's the most kind of basic way to coach. So, if you've got come back to that cross rider example, do you know what I mean? They're going to have to produce high powers at low forces. So we can do that sort of work with them. There's some potential that it increases kind of sort of neuromuscular signaling and firing rates and that sort of stuff potentially. But honestly, this, we all try and be evidence-based or evidence-informed at least. The evidence for that sort of work is pretty scant, if not non-existent. But like I say, it's something I do with my athletes, and it does seem to have that kind of, have a benefit. Where that benefit comes from exactly would be pure speculation on my part.
Yeah, we're not there with the why, but there's certainly empirical evidence to suggest it's worth playing around with the right person. Okay, so question here from Gabriel. Should I worry about torque application during a pedal revolution? I'm thinking about this metrics like torque effectiveness.
Yeah, I think yes is probably the answer I'd give. So where that peak torque comes in, so obviously torque isn't, we don't give a perfect, let's say 40 Newton meters throughout the whole pedal stroke, if that makes sense. That is an average, or, it's an instantaneous point, whichever kind of way you look at it. So where that peak torque comes in within sort of the range of motion, if that makes sense, will have an influence. So you saw it with the data I presented with the three kind of curves and at 60 and 180. Actually, that athlete in question was essentially on one of their pushes, their peak torque was coming in very late. I think on the left arm, it was coming in very late. So actually, by the time they'd accelerated that arm, they'd almost run out of pusher in to push against, if that makes sense. And then I mentioned earlier that we only really, with mobile power meters, we only measure propulsive torque. So unless you get athletes on a force pedal, essentially, they might be applying forces to that pedal that aren't in a propulsive direction. And in that case, they would be producing metabolic power, if you like. So they're doing the work internally, but they're not converting that into power at the pedal. And actually seeing some athletes that, you would test them and you think they're doing a pretty good job. And then you put them on kind of force pedals and actually they're doing a pretty terrible job of applying the power that, the metabolic power, if you like, that they're creating to the pedal. And there was some quite easy gains to be had with that athlete.
And I think this may be our final question coming from Jonathan Wiggins, who, again, look back on our channel. We had another really good webinar with Jonathan talking about aerodynamics. His question here is, if you're using high-speed power meters, then have you studied the torque velocity of the pedal stroke, for example, for climbers accelerating out the saddle?
Not personally, but there is a little bit of literature out there on it. It would appear that essentially we try and, once the reason that people get out the saddle is to minimize the internal load to produce that torque, if that makes sense. So if steepening in the kind of the gradient or something, that is obviously creates a higher torque requirement to keep those pedals moving at the same rate, and that's the stimulation for the rider to get out the saddle. But I think it comes back to Robert's question a little bit earlier about have we looked at how force is applied in that acceleration phase, and does that bring about better acceleration, or is there ways that we can kind of optimize that? No, that's not something we've kind of gone down that route with just yet. No.
More research needed.
Yeah. There's always avenues to explore. Yeah, for sure.
Excellent. So if anybody wants to come along and team up and do some research, then
I've got plenty of data that I can send to people to analyze on my behalf.
Absolutely. We need some more master's students to pick up some of that and crunch some numbers for us. We talked a little bit about the kind of training for maybe those low cadences, but what about from your sort of coaching perspective about training for the higher cadences and trying to shift the athlete's ability to produce those higher cadences? What do you do there?
Yeah, so that was interesting. So the track rider, so we managed to actually, in that kind of last actually a few weeks just before the event, when we were starting to move into the taper, we saw an increase in essentially the cadence at which they could apply their peak force essentially. And the way we tracked that was with basically motor pacing. So we were getting the journey to ride at a fixed pace around the track. We were getting that rider to sit in at a gear so that we knew that we could control their cadence, and then we were attacking off the we were getting that rider to attack off the bike essentially. With that particular athlete, the assisted kind of strength work seemed to work really well. So when we brought in that assisted work, so that was obviously like squat jumps, but with bands kind of assisting that spring, if that makes sense. When we moved from exercises whereby there's a stop, if you like. So if you do a squat, obviously you have to decelerate the bar at the top of the squat. So we moved to kind of things like jump squats, where you're not having to decelerate that bar to stop yourself coming off the ground. That's when we started to see those increases in the cadence at which they can apply that peak torque. That probably coincided with a slight reduction in training load as well. So it may be that the reduction in training load allowed those adaptations to come through as well. So a kind of a combination of those factors allowed us to kind of shift that torque velocity relationship kind of rightwards and upwards for that athlete.
Yeah. So that comes back to that question about fatigue and whether it's metabolic fatigue, neural fatigue. What's the sort of the implications there? So yeah, but lots of things to experiment with our own cycling and with our athletes that we're working with. Okay, I think that's all our questions. I'm not sure if Bianca's coming back live or not. She was having some issues with the Wi-Fi not uploading particularly well, so her visuals were a bit grainy. So James, if people want to kind of read a bit more for your work or find out a bit more about you, we'll put links in the description down below. There you go, she's going to stay in the background. We'll put links in the description down below, so click on the links for James. But do you want to give a kind of final wrap up of if people want to follow you on social media or websites, where can people find out a bit more about you?
Yeah, sure. So Spragg_perform is my Twitter, which I'm pretty active on. And then ResearchGate, for those of you who have ResearchGate, if they want any kind of the papers that we've published recently, then just James Spragg on ResearchGate, and then send me a message on that if there are any papers that take your fancy, and I can send them across.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for your time. That was a really interesting presentation, and yeah, some good ideas put forward from our listeners. So finally, thank you very much. We've got another couple of webinars lined up for next month. So look out on our social media. Bianca will be putting up the details for those, and we're going to be moving into exploring the concept of REDS, so the relative energy deficiency in sport. So we've got a talk by a strength and conditioning coach, Morgan, and a nutritionist, Liz. So look out for those ones coming up next month. Thank you very much for your time. See you later now.